Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our weekly program on the miracles in the gospel. We base our weekly study on Sunday evenings on the West Coast on Genesis. Genesis has a whole section dedicated to the miracles in the gospel. And in the last few months, we've studied a lot. We found out that what was considered to be a miracle in the past, or many miracles in the past, since Spiritism has come along, we can't explain and is no longer a miracle. Because there is spiritual science, thanks to Allan Kardec, that clearly explains that the so-called miracles are actually scientifically to be explained. So the last week we talked about the temptations of Jesus. And this week we will move on to the wonders surrounding Jesus' death. This is item 54, which you find in Genesis. And starts with item 54, and we continue with 55. And then we will be talking about the disappearance of Jesus' body at the grave. So welcome, dear friends. It's a pleasure to have you. Let me see that I switch over to, so I can actually see you guys. So please, let's make it interactive. Say hello, introduce yourself. And if you'd like to add any information or have any questions, feel free to post them. So item 54, and we find that in Matthew 27 and to 45, 51 to 53. Now, from the 6th hour of the day until the 9th, the whole earth was covered in darkness. So for 3 hours, Matthew reports that the whole world was covered in darkness. At the same time, the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook. The rocks split. The graves were opened, and many bodies of saints who were in the sleep of death came back to life. So resurrections happened. And leaving their graves after Jesus' resurrection, they came to the holy city and were seen by many people. So this sounds incredible, doesn't it? Between the hours of 3 p.m., 6 p.m., and 9 p.m., a 3-hour span, all of this happened. The earth became dark, rocks split, and saints resurrected alongside with Jesus. Is that a miracle? Are those miracles? Allan Kardec helps us to understand. And of course, let's keep in mind, Allan Kardec was a scientific person, and he looked at these phenomena impassionately. In other words, he looked at it with a scientific perspective. Now let us see what he says about this. It is strange that such wonders occurring at the same moment in which the city's attention was fixed upon Jesus' death went unnoticed. So what he's first of all pointing out, everyone was focused on Jesus' death and these wonders of total darkness. For 3 hours, total darkness. The whole world was covered in darkness. Rocks split, saints resurrected, went unnoticed. For no historian makes the least reference to them. That's curious, isn't it? It seems impossible that an earthquake and the whole earth covered in darkness for 3 hours in a country where the sky is always perfectly clear, sounds like California, could have gone unnoticed. Right? Makes sense. That something in a country where the weather is always good and the sky is blue, all of a sudden, boom, it's dark for 3 hours, would have gone unnoticed. The length of such darkness was nearly that of an eclipse of the sun, but eclipses of that type occur only during the time of the new moon. And Jesus' death occurred during the full moon on the 14th day of the month of Nisan. So Jesus' death occurred at a full moon. So how could it be that an eclipse of the sun lasting 3 hours could have happened, which only happens on a new moon? The darkening of the sun could have been caused by sunspots. So this is another hypothesis, which may be observed on the sun's surface. In such case, the brilliance of its light is weakened noticeably, but never to the point of causing obscurity and darkness. So these sunspots that can actually be found on the surface of the sun, they create a certain dimming of the light, but they do not apparently cause obscurity or darkness. Admitting that a phenomenon of this kind had actually occurred at that time, it would have had a perfectly natural cause. Allan Kardec is very logical. He says, nobody's mentioning these phenomena. No historian has. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't explained. It can't be really explained because the natural phenomena behind it doesn't make sense. Sunspots doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense that an eclipse happened when it was full moon and eclipses only happen at new moon, and the list goes on. Then he says, as for the dead who came back to life, it could be that a few persons had been visions or had seen visions or apparitions, which is not unusual. However, since they were not aware of the cause of such phenomena, they supposed that the figures they saw had come from the grave. Very good point, right? Where did they come from? Wasn't clear. It was probably just an assumption, because for sure, nobody knows where they came from. If, in fact, they actually saw apparitions. Distressed by the death of their Lord, Jesus' disciples undoubtedly connected it with a few particular events, to which on any other occasion they would have not paid any attention. It would have been enough for a piece of rock at that moment to have split apart for individuals inclined to the extraordinary to have regarded it as a wonder. So only one of those things, like just splitting of the rock, would have been enough. And those who exaggerating the fact stated that the rocks had split apart. So it doesn't quite make sense. It's not logically explainable. Jesus, and this is really the important part. This is really the important part now. That seals the argument that it is unlikely that any of this actually happened. Jesus is great due to his works and not due to fantastic imagery, with which enthusiasm, with little enlightenment, believed it necessary to surround him with. So Jesus in itself, his work was so incredible. Let's just remember all the healings that he performed, the teachings, his model lifestyle. Is that not enough? Does he still have to prove himself, or do people still have to prove that Jesus was an extraordinary human being by creating these fantastic events surrounding his death, like 3 hours of darkness, splitting rocks, saints, resurrection? No. According to Allan Kardec, it was most likely just enthusiasts with little enlightenment that believed it to be necessary to surround Jesus' passing, Jesus' death, with these supposed miracles. All right, does that make sense? Makes sense to us. All right, and if we really look at it, it's pretty inconsequential, right? Whether the earth was dark for 3 hours and rocks split and saints resurrected, as it pales in comparison, we may say, to Jesus's beautiful actions, his healings, all of what he accomplished in his short life. To this day, we're marveling at it. To this day, we're struggling to emulate him, to learn about him, right? So let me say hi, Flavia. Thank you so much for joining. And Teresa Castro, thank you so much for joining, dear friend. And Tony, dear friend, thanks for joining. And there's so many more, so please do say hello. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the disappearance of Jesus's body. Now, there is something, the apparition of Jesus after his death, which we will preserve for next week, because it's a beautiful finale of the section of the miracles in the gospel, focusing on the beauty, on the magnificence that Jesus embodied. So today we're going to go and talk about the disappearance of his body. So we find a section in John 20 on the disappearance of his body. And we're going to read this. It's item 56. Shedding tears, Mary Magdalene, however, remained outside close to the tomb. And as she was weeping, she bent down to look inside the tomb and saw two angels dressed in white, and seated in the place where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the feet. So there was an angel at the head and an angel at the feet, but no body. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She answered, "They have taken my Lord, and I don't know where they have put him." So we all know that Jesus' body had disappeared when Mary Magdalene reached the cave. And she found these two angels saying, "Why are you weeping?" And she's wondering, where did you take the body of my Lord? So let us go to item 64, the disappearance of Jesus' body in Genesis, page 359, if you like to look it up. And let us see what Ellen Kardec helps us to understand about the disappearance of Jesus' body. The disappearance of Jesus' body after his death has been the object of numerous commentaries. It is attested to by the four evangelists, based on the report of the women who went to his tomb on the third day, only to find that he was not there. Some have seen a miraculous event in this disappearance. Others attribute it to a clandestine removal. But what is it? According to another opinion, Jesus did not have a corporeal body. So this is the third one. So the first one, that interpretation of this event is that it is a clandestine removal, a miraculous event, or Jesus didn't even have a physical body. So according to a third one, to another opinion, Jesus did not have a corporeal body at all, but only what? A fluidic body. So this is also an option. Throughout his entire life, he was only a tangible apparition, these people are saying. In other words, a kind of a generate. We're going to look at that in a minute. His birth, death, and all the physical acts of his life were only an appearance. Thus, it has been said that his body, having returned to the fluidic state, could disappear from the tomb. And it was with this same body that he showed himself after his death. So taking this theory further, then it would have made perfect sense for because he would have only had a fluidic body throughout its entire life. So now his supposed death, well, there would have not really been one, because the fluidic body, we know, continues on to live with the soul. And of course, it would have been able to not stay in the cave, but rise, right? So it would have been taking this theory on our mental level through to the end, makes sense on some level, right? It would explain that his body had disappeared because it was a fluidic body. Without a doubt, such a fact is not radically impossible. Ellen Kardec admits to that. according to what is known today about the properties of the fluids, and we've studied them. However, it would at the least be completely exceptional and in formal opposition to the character of it generates. So it would be at the least be completely exceptional and in formal opposition to the character of it generates. The issue is therefore to determine if such a hypothesis is acceptable and whether it is confirmed or contradicted by the facts. So why would Allan Kardec say that this theory does not, however, make sense if we understand it generates correctly? Now, some of you may remember that many weeks ago, we actually studied it generates, that section of the fluids it's part of the chapter of fluids in Genesis. And let us go back for a moment to jog our memory, because then it will make much more sense that Allan Kardec says that, maybe not. This may not make sense, right? This idea that Jesus never had a physical body, flesh and blood. Let's go to chapter 14, item 36. You find that on page 305. And here, Allan Kardec was teaching us. It should be noted that tangible apparitions, which is generates, are the ones who are tangible apparitions. It's the same thing. So it should be noted that tangible apparitions have only the appearance of corporeal matter. They could not possess its qualities. Due to their fluidic nature, they cannot have the same cohesion as matter, because in reality, they are not made of flesh. Makes total sense, right? Because apparitions are fluidic. They only appear to be looking like you and I, but in true fact, there's no blood, there's no bones, and there's no flesh. These apparitions form instantly and disappear the same way, or they evaporate through the disaggregation of their fluidic molecules. So they can appear instantaneously, disappear, or just evaporate. The beings that appear under such conditions are not born, nor do they die like human beings. They can't, right? Because they don't have a physical body, not a dense physical body. They are seen and no longer seen without the observer knowing where they have come from, how they have come, or where they are going. So, such is the nature of it generates, right? So these are the apparitions. Such is the nature of it generates, with whom one may communicate without suspecting that they are it generates, but who do not stay very long and cannot partake in the habitual sharing of food at homes, nor be counted among the members of a family. So this is really important for us to have Jesus in our mind. So we all know all the stories about Jesus from the Bible, from the Gospel. We know it through the Spiritist literature. Does it make sense that Jesus did not have a physical body when we look at this definition of it generates? Yes, we may communicate with them. We may not suspect that they are actually only a fluidic body, but they can't stay very long and cannot partake in the habitual sharing of food. Well, we've had many stories where Jesus was sharing in food, right? And it's not like he didn't stay very long. He did. Then it says, you can't see them at homes for very long, nor can they be counted among the members of a family, because they're fluidic bodies. They don't hang around very long. They come and they go, which makes sense when we think about this disappearance from the tomb, but not when we look at the whole life of Jesus. Let's continue. Moreover, in their entire person and in their steps, there's something strange and unusual that derives from their materiality and spirituality. So when we see them, they seem strange. The way they move, those fluidic bodies. Their gaze, vaporous and penetrating at the same time, does not have the clarity of the gaze through corporeal eyes. Now remember Lucio and Brother X, Umberto de Campos, When they're describing Jesus, the nonverbal lessons are so strong in these two books. How often are there references made to his moves and his eyes, to his facial features? It wouldn't quite make sense to think that he was only in fluidic body, right? The speech is brief and almost always terse, possessing nothing of the luster or volubility of human speech. The proximity makes one feel an odd, indefinable sensation of unease that inspires a sort of fear. And taken as individuals like all others, one may say unintentionally. Now that is a peculiar person. So this just jogs our memory of generates. And so now we understand a little bit better why Alan Kardec puts a big question mark behind this theory, that Jesus actually never had a dense physical body, but just a vaporous body, a perispirit. He only appeared in perispirit. So let's go back to item 65. And now let's see what else Alan Kardec teaches us. Jesus' stay on the earth entails two periods, that which precedes his death and that which follows his death. In the former, namely what the period that precedes his death, from the moment of conception to birth, everything regarding his mother happens as it does in the normal conditions of life. From his birth until his death, everything about his acts, his language, and the various circumstances of his life reveals the unequivocal characteristics of corporeality. So this points towards the fact that he had a body like you and I. The psychic phenomena that occur in him are unexpected, but there's nothing abnormal about them, because we know that it's a phenomena that you and I can even experience and do at times. So the psychic phenomena that occur, there's nothing abnormal about them, since they can be explained by the properties of the perispirit and may be found in differing degrees among other individuals. Right? After his death, on the other hand, everything about him reveals a fluidic being. Right? Every appearance that Jesus makes, first the disciples don't recognize him, and then they do. It's strange. It's not the same. They're not like, oh yeah, Master, there you are. It takes a little while for them to catch on. It makes sense that, of course, Jesus appeared in perispirit to the disciples after his discarnation. The corporeal body has the properties inherent to matter per se, properties that differ essentially from those of the ethereal fluids. It's a difference, right? In matter, breakdown occurs because of the rupture of molecular cohesion. That is part of getting sick, getting older. Okay? There's a breakdown that's happening. A cutting instrument can penetrate the physical body and divide its tissues. If the organs essentially to life are attacked, the body stops functioning and death follows. That is the death of the body, this body. Since this cohesion does not exist in fluidic bodies, life does not lie in the functioning of special organs. So in other words, the perispirit is not reliant on the liver and the heart and the stomach and the bladder and the kidneys and all the organs we have in the lungs. Because life in the perispirit is different from life in the physical form. The life in the physical form is dependent on these organs for us to stay alive, right? Not in the perispirit. A cutting instrument or any other instrument can penetrate a fluidic body like a cloud of vapor without causing any sort of lesion. That is why bodies of this kind cannot die. There's no bleeding. There's no loss of life. There's no organs per se. And this is why fluidic beings called agenerates cannot be killed. Of course not, right? Makes all perfect sense. I think we're all clear on that. After the death of Jesus, his inert and lifeless body was entombed like any other body. So after death of Jesus, after Jesus' death, his inert and lifeless body, which means this physical form, where the perispirit had now disconnected from the physical body, and then our physical body becomes inert, lifeless. You can stab a dead body and it's not responding. There's no pain. So after the death of Jesus, his inert and lifeless body was entombed like any other body. And anyone could see and touch it. Right? After his resurrection, when he was ready to leave earth behind, he did not die again. No, it's only one death, and that's the death of the body made out of flesh and blood. Instead, his body rose, dissipated, and vanished without leaving a trace. Obvious proof that that body was of a different nature than the one that perished on the cross. So, of course, the narrators of the time did not know the distinction. I mean, how long did it take us? It took us up until Spiritism, essentially, to understand the distinction of the perispirit and the physical body, that they both can appear to be the same, and yet there's this difference that we just saw in the chapter of the fluids on agenerates, on apparitions. So it is clear that the body after his death, the one that disappeared, was a different one, namely a fluidic one. Hence, one must conclude that if Jesus could die, it was because he had a body of flesh. The whole scene on the cross, right? The blood, the account, his suffering, the words, what he spoke. It all points towards the fact that this was a physical body that was nailed to the cross. Due to its material properties, the corporeal body is the seat of sensation and physical pain. So our physical bodies are the seat of sensation and physical pain, which reverberate within the sensitive center or the spirit. So, okay, this itch just here, right? That appeared in the physical body, but it gets transmuted to the sensitive center, which is the spirit. It is not the body that suffers, ultimately. It's not, these are not my words. This is Alan Kardec. And we've seen that also in Heaven and Hell and in Genesis, and I think also in the Spirit's book. Alan Kardec was wondering too about that. So it's important for us to know that it is not the body that suffers. It is the spirit, which receives the counterblow from the lesions or the alterations in the organic tissue. So the sensation happens on the physical body. These sensations get transmitted via the nerves to the spirit. It's the spirit that feels the pain. In a body deprived of the spirit, sensation is lacking entirely. That becomes inert matter when the body is lifeless, not connected, as vitality has left, the perispirit is disconnected. There is no more sensation of pain. For the same reason, the spirit that has no physical body cannot experience suffering. Spirit cannot experience suffering when it doesn't have a body, which is the result of the alteration of matter, because there is no more matter where these sensations might be happening. The lesions, the cutting. Hence, one must also conclude that if Jesus suffered physically, which cannot be doubted, according to Allan Kardec, it was because he had a physical body of a nature similar to everybody's body else's. So this is a little bit of a difficult concept for us to understand, that the body is not the one that suffers, because it sure feels like it, doesn't it? When we have pain, it feels like the body is suffering. But it's really the spirit that feels the pain. And then when the body falls off, the physical body falls off, the sensation of pain, and we learn that in Heaven and Hell in many of the cases that Allan Kardec presents us with, where the spirits report back that their sensation of pain is amorph. It's not centralized in one spot. Like with our body, if I pinch myself right here on the cheek, that's where I feel the pain. But without the physical body, it's not the case. It's the same with sensations, like vision. We see through these two eyes. But when the physical body falls off, the seeing is an overall seeing. There are no two eyes anymore that see. It's different. It's not as focused, because there are no organs. And the instrument of pain, which is the body, is not there anymore. So I hope that's kind of clear. I know it's different, but so the bottom line that Allan Kardec is trying to help us understand is that Jesus must have had a physical body, because he obviously suffered. And he would have not been able to had he not have had a physical body, because the perispirit alone does not have the same pain sensation that we have when we are in this physical form. Okay, let us move on to item 66. The strongest moral considerations must be added to the physical events. So we just talked about the physical events. Now let's look at the moral considerations. If during his life Jesus existed in the state of fluidic beings, if during his life Jesus had existed in the state of fluidic beings, he would have felt neither pain nor bodily needs. Makes sense, right? To suppose such to have been the case is to take from him all the merit of the life of privation and suffering that he chose as an example of resignation. So this is huge. Just as when we spoke about these so-called miraculous events right around Jesus's death, the earth getting all dark for 3 hours and rocks splitting and all that, did Jesus really need these fantastic events in order to prove his grandiosity? This sounds egoic, his grandeur, this amazing being who walked the earth for a few years. Does he really need rock splitting to prove how great he was? No, his deeds speak louder than anything else, his teachings. So it was necessary. Makes total sense. And now, to claim that Jesus never had a body would take away the moral considerations, would point to the fact that the merit of his life of privation and suffering that he chose as an example of resignation would have been null and void. Now one could say, oh, ho-hum, so then it wasn't. But can we imagine for a moment, or just looking at our own lives, how much that teaches us, how helpful the fact that Jesus lived a life of privation and suffering, how much that helps us to this moment today, 2020 years later, 2000 years later. How wonderful that is to know that this evolved soul suffered and how he suffered, teaching us how to suffer well. It's a whole chapter in the gospel on this, how to suffer well, how to suffer right. Blessed are the afflicted, for they shall be comforted. It's all hinging on learning from Jesus's life. He's our guide and model. And he showed to us how to live a life of privation, how to do it correctly, how to be of service. His Beatitudes are teaching us all about how to be in the flesh in a dignified way, ascending closer to God. All of this would have been scratched had he not had a body of flesh and bones and blood. Something to consider, right? Why take that away? Doesn't make sense because it's so helpful, it's so consoling to us. If everything in his life was only an appearance, all the events of his life, his repeated statements regarding his death, the dolorous scene in the Garden of Olives, his prayer to God to remove the cup from his lips, his passion and his death, everything, up to the last cry when he delivered up his spirit, would have been only a vain sham of deception regarding his true nature and meant to create a belief in the illusory sacrifice of his life. It would have all just been an illusion. A farce unworthy of a simple and honest man, and for even more reason of such a highly evolved being. Let us let that sink in. That seems to be the most striking argument because it affects us today. This is my refrigerator making these noises. All right, so let us look at the sentence. It's very long. It's a run-on sentence, and let us look at it again and break it apart a little bit. So Allan Kardec is now arguing that morally doesn't make sense that Allan Kardec only had a fluidic body. Then everything in his life would have been just an appearance. That in itself doesn't feel right? For such an evolved being, all the events of his life, his repeated statements regarding his death, the dolorous scene in the Garden of Olives, we all know that, right? His prayer to God to remove the cup from his lips, his passion and death, everything up to the last cry when he delivered up his spirit would have been only a vain sham. It's just not logical, right? A vain sham for Jesus to be vain, and a vain sham of deception regarding his true nature. And it would have given us the belief in an illusory sacrifice of his life. It would have been all a lie, essentially, an illusion, a farce unworthy of a simple and honest man, and even less so for a very highly evolved soul. In other words, he would have abused the good faith of his contemporaries, and ultimately us too still, right? For thousands of years, this would have been an illusion. In other words, he would have abused the good faith of his contemporaries and all posterity. If we feel into that, we know it's not true, right? It doesn't resonate. It just can't, it's just not right. Such are the logical consequences of that theory. And thank you, Allan Kardec, for being so logical. Because logic, it helps us to brighten our light of discernment. Because we know the truth. We know how it feels, right? We know. It doesn't matter whether it's in this regard or whether it's with medicine or politics. It doesn't matter what it is. If we tune in, we know what's true and what's not, right? So such are the logical consequences of that theory, consequences that are unacceptable because they morally degrade rather than elevate him. Yes. and they would rip the carpet from under us. It would just be, and what merit would be in that? To take Jesus away from mankind. The teachings, the beauty, the modeling, the guiding. So there's a little footnote. And the footnote is after the sentence that such a theory would be unacceptable and would just morally degrade Jesus and not elevate him. In light of the communications and phenomena appearing after the departure of Kardec, we must conclude that it was not really a vain sham, just as there was no sham when Jesus, after his death, stated the words that are recorded in Luke 24, verse 39. It is I. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh or bone, as you see that I do. So Jesus even pointed it out himself. So it can't be a vain sham, according to the publisher's note. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to morally degrade Jesus on that level. Thus, like any other man, Jesus had both a corporeal body and a fluidic one, a fact attested to by the physical and psychic phenomena that highlighted his life. This is the conclusion, that Jesus must have had a physical body. And Allan Kardec is just like in a dissertation outlining to us exactly why this is the only logical explanation. So then he adds, which is interesting, item 67, where he revisits now some who believed that Jesus' body was only a fluidic one. So here he adds. So we have now agreed with Allan Kardec that he must have had a physical form. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense, both on the scientific level as well as the moral level. Item 67. This idea about the nature of Jesus' body is nothing new, of him just having a fluidic body. In the 4th century, Apollinarius of Laodicea, head of the Apollinarian sect, claimed that Jesus had not taken a body like ours, but rather an impassible body that descended out of heaven into the lap of the Holy Virgin, but which was not born from her. So there is a group of people in the 4th century in Apollinarius that claimed that Jesus' body came out of heaven and was dropped into the Holy Virgin's lap, but wasn't born through her. Thus, Jesus had not been born and had not suffered or died except in appearance, according to this theory. The Apollinarians were anathematized, which means condemned, by the Council of Alexandria in 360, the Council of Rome in 374, and the Council of Constantinople in 381. So there have been 3 different areas, Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople, in different years consecutive, in the year 360, 374, and 381. And there, the Apollinarians' theory of Jesus dropping into the Virgin's lap and not having had a body of flesh and blood was condemned. Now, there was another group, the Docetists, from the Greek dokein, to appear, a prolific sect of Gnostics that survived for the first 3 centuries, also for 300, held the same belief. So the Gnostics also believed that. So for the first 300 years after Jesus' death, there were certain groups, albeit small, that believed that he did not have a physical body. So Allan Kardec adds that to the story. I guess it completes for us the picture of who was a proponent of that, but he explained to us very clearly that it does not make sense. It doesn't make sense morally, and it doesn't make sense scientifically, physically. All right, dear friends, are there any questions, any comments? To summarize, those fantastic events around his discarnation, according to Allan Kardec, didn't really happen because that didn't make sense scientifically. Didn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense that Jesus needed them to prove his grandeur, his elevation. And as far as his body disappearing, it was clearly a fluidic body after his discarnation, but a physical form, just like you and I, during his lifespan. He felt sensations. He lived a life of deprivation. He pointed out to others that he had a body of flesh and blood. All of his moral teachings that help us to this day stem from the fact that he had a physical body, a dense physical vest, like we do. And that helps us to this day. So it does not logically make sense that he only had, that this was all just appearance, that this was all just an illusion, that Jesus actually was walking on the earth like you and I. It's beautiful. Makes sense, gives us peace, and at the end of the day, the most important aspect really is the moral one, right? Yes, hello sunshine and everyone. Did Allan Kardec consider Jesus God or an evolved spirit? In the Spirit's book, Allan Kardec is asking one of the questions of who was the most evolved spirit on earth, the most evolved human being on earth. And the spirits on high answered, look to Jesus Christ. So he didn't see him as God from that, judging from that, but as the most evolved spirit being to walk the earth. So I hope that answers that. So what happened to his physical body? Yep, good question. That we don't get an explanation here. Yes, Allan Kardec does not go into that in any depth or clarity. I think there are interpretations among the theologians that his body, I don't know. I don't have the answer. So anyone else? I think that's it. So next week, what we will talk about is the apparition of Jesus after his death. And that will culminate with a beautiful, beautiful tribute to Jesus that we are already looking forward to. So, dear friends, thank you so much for joining. And thank you, God, for bringing Jesus to us. Thank you. Thank you for having given us a model that shows us of how to be humble, to not overstate our material bodies, but to sacrifice ourselves, to live, to serve, to support others, to elevate our sentiments, to accumulate knowledge and practice the good, the two wings that help us to ascend closer to you. And thank you for all the teachings that come through the spirits on high, expressed by Spiritism through the mediums from the spirits on high, helping us further to understand this exceptional being, namely Jesus, who to this day helps us through how he conducted his life in helping us with our incarnations, allowing us to look at someone who is most perfect, who's so much more perfect than we are, so we can have a guide and model. And for that, we are extremely grateful. It feels consoling and supportive. Thank you, God. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Alan Kardec. And so be it. Thank you, friends. We're filled with gratitude. So we'll see you, so God willing, next time, next week, same place, same time, with a continuation of our study. God bless you, dear friends. Bye.